So, good evening, ma'am. So, first of all, I welcome you all on our first Women Cancer Symposium today on 31st March 2021, Wednesday evening. And I would like to thanks to the entire team of AstraZeneca for arranging a webinar on the ovarian cancer. So we all know there's a lot of new development in the management of ovarian cancer. Previously, we have only surgery and chemotherapy was the main treatment modality. But with the current updates, we have a newer molecule as well as the new technique in the treatment of ovarian cancer. We have incorporated HIPEC in the treatment of ovarian cancer. We have a newer molecules like PARP inhibitor, and we have immunotherapy drugs, which we have started using in the management of ovarian cancer. For the today's theme, we'll start with our first talk that is on HIPEC in the ovarian cancer by Dr. Swati Shah, and she's our consultant. So let me begin by inviting our first talk to Dr. Swati Shah, and she's going to speak on the HIPEC and ovarian cancers. So, madam, over to you. Please share your screen.
A very good evening to all of you. I'll be talking about a role of HIPEC in ovarian cancer. HIPEC, we all know, is the hyperthermic intraperitoneal chemotherapy. So in this short talk, I will be talking about 4 things. One, the HIPEC, the rationale and the technique. Then I'll be talking about the patient selection, because that is the most crucial thing when we are planning HIPEC. Then the importance of cytoreductive surgery. We are talking about HIPEC, but we should not forget the importance of cytoreductive surgery, because that is the main key according to which the effect of HIPEC is going to be seen. Next, I'll be talking about the timing of HIPEC, the role in the primary as well as interval, sort of primary versus interval. I'll not go into the secondary and consolidation, but that is also the indication of HIPEC in the present scenario, though not proven with the randomized trials. So coming to the content-wise, first I'll be talking about the rationale and technique of HIPEC. Ovarian malignancy has been an enigma. It is the worst of all the gynec malignancy, though it constitutes the 14% of all gynec malignancies, but more than 2/3 are diagnosed in late stage. Whichever state or country the patients are in, most of them present to us in stage 3, that is the advanced ovarian cancer, be it the presentation, the wake symptoms, and the business of the females. The ovarian cancers are notorious to be caught late. They are the leading cause of death among the gynec cancers, and although successfully treated initially, we know that most of them will recur. So this is the worst cancer, female cancer, to have, with the 5-year overall survival less than 50%. This is the cancer which needs most attention, and the more of the latest technology coming up in the oncology may help us to overcome this cancer. Coming to the HIPEC, that is the hyperthermic intraperitoneal chemotherapy. This is highly concentrated, heated chemotherapy that is delivered directly to the peritoneal cavity at the end of the surgery. So initially we were talking about the EPIC, that is early post-operative chemotherapy, or the chemotherapy is given as intervals, like after, every 3 weekly with the ports inserted. But they had their own complications, and somehow the compliance was not that good. So this HIPEC has been shown to be of increased value in these days. It allows for higher dose of chemotherapy drugs to be directly delivered to the cancer cells in the peritoneal cavity, and heated solution improves the absorption of the chemotherapy by the tumor and also destroys the microscopic cells that remain in the cavity after surgery. So coming to the rationale, that is the IV drugs we give may not be available to the peritoneum surfaces as good as the intraperitoneal chemotherapy would be. The only caveat is that it would be able to penetrate only 3 to 5 mm. So we have to ensure that complete cytoreduction, or at least a CC1 cytoreduction, about which I'll be talking about later, has been achieved. So the various trials have shown improvement with the intraperitoneal chemotherapy. That is, the intraperitoneal drug delivery increases the peritoneal penetration, and that depends on the what sort of chemotherapy we are giving, but it does increase the penetration. So coming to the rationale, first, the chemotherapy directly delivered to the peritoneal cavity, so higher killing. Second, we know the epithelial ovarian cancers are chemosensitive. So better the action of chemotherapy, direct cell killing, we are definitely going to increase the survival of the patients. Next is the minimizing of the complications. Though the systemic complications now are very nicely managed by the medical oncologist, but we know that the complications of the systemic chemotherapy might limit us from giving certain doses of chemotherapy. So giving them intraperitoneally, you can increase the doses of these chemotherapy, and we are benefiting the patients more. Heat, that is, heat has done wonders over the human civilization. We started with making fire out of the heat by cracking the stones. We cook our food, and now it is time. The heat is helping us to fight this cancer. So direct cell killing potentiates the cytotoxic effect of sub-chemotherapy action agents and helps us to increase the survival of the patients. That has been proven also. Concentration of chemotherapy is higher in peritoneal cavity, more than the plasma when we are giving in the systemic chemotherapy. So this is definitely going to help us. That was the hypothesis sometime before, but it has been proven in the trials now. Ovarian malignancy is the notorious one, that is, it is disseminated peritoneally, and it is considered more of a loco-regional problem than a systemic disease. So on the one hand, we say that the peritoneal cancers like ovarian cancer are diagnosed in stage 3, but the other hand, I would say that it is a good thing that it is still loco-regional. It is giving us time so that we can operate on them, and with this, the intraperitoneal chemotherapy, we have a chance of curing them. So this is the rationale for HIPEC. This is a short video of HIPEC. It's a short video of HIPEC, which shows that the abdominal cavity, the peritoneum, first thing is to complete the cytoreductive surgery, in which a big incision is there from the xiphisternum to the symphysis pubis. The ovaries are removed, the uterus is removed, and then the peritoneum and all the disease is removed. That is the importance of the cytoreductive surgery, that all of the disease which is seen by the naked eyes, that is the macroscopic disease, is removed, though the resection will be still R1. We call it CC0, but it will be R1, that microscopic cells may be there. That will be taken up by care of by this chemotherapy, which is being given by either the closed technique or open technique. There is an inlet and an outlet. So the chemo drug moves inside the abdominal cavity. It is heated by the special machine, and it has a pump also through which the chemotherapy is circulated inside the abdomen, and it is going to act directly on the microscopic cells or the less than 5 mm disease that is left behind or that is roaming around in the abdomen after the surgery. So that is the importance of the HIPEC. So when we talk about HIPEC, first thing we talk about is the completeness of cytoreduction. Whenever we are even counseling our patients, we tell them that you take the decision if you want HIPEC or not, but final decision would be taken by us, because it is the most important thing is that the surgery has to be complete. The completeness of cytoreductive score, that is CC0, either the tumor is not visible at all, or CC1, that is the residual nodules are less than 2.5 mm. That is our criteria. Though in the trial, they have shown that up to 1 centimeter, that is the CC2, more than 2.5 mm, up to 1 centimeter, they have included in the trial, that these patients will be benefited because this cytoreduction was initially called as optimal cytoreduction. These patients would be also benefited from the intraperitoneal chemotherapy. So the chemotherapy drug that is given in the HIPEC depends on the pharmacokinetic of the molecule, the weight of the molecule, the level of plasma clearance, and the action of which is potentiated by the hyperthermia. So accordingly, the cisplatin fits them all better, which is already known to be active in ovarian cancers. So this is the drug which is used for 90 minutes in ovarian cancer, though the dose used is 100 milligram per meter square at 42 degrees. So now that was about the rationale. Now coming to patient selection. Patient selection, when we talk about, depends on the pre-operative workup. And believe me, this is a multidisciplinary approach that is only responsible for the HIPEC program that is running up at various institutes. From medical oncologists to anesthetists and to the physiotherapist and the dietitian. Everyone is important. The radiologist, the pathologist, the nurses, everyone is important in the patient selection, as well as the pre-operative and intraoperative and post-operative course of the patient. So all these references are done: the cardiac fitness, the pulmonary fitness, the pathological, that is the blood tests, everything is done. The patients are given spirometry so that their lungs are better, the dietary advice is given, and the patients are evaluated for the HIPEC. So one thing is, if the patient is fit or not, then comes the second thing, that is the disease is fit or not. That means if we are able to completely remove the disease, or at least optimal, or that was the initial word used, optimal cytoreduction, that is the less than 1 centimeter disease left behind. So that was about the patient selection, that is the patient factors and the disease factors. Now coming to the importance of cytoreductive surgery. Cytoreductive surgery is the one surgery when we start in the morning and we have to finish by the evening, because it includes total parietal peritonectomy, anterior peritonectomy, upper quadrant peritonectomy, splenectomy may be done, oventectomy has to be done, right upper quadrant peritonectomy, which requires mobilization of the liver. All these things may appear like many surgeries, but these have to be done because the removal of the disease, the diseased peritoneum and these diseased organs is of the utmost importance. That is only going to benefit the patient, added with the HIPEC, where the patient will get the better benefit. This is the picture of the anterior peritoneum that is being removed without entering the abdomen. The disease is inside. We are going outside the peritoneum. This is the pelvic peritonectomy being performed. These are the nodules on the pelvic peritoneum. Uterus also shows the various nodules present, but it is operable and everything is being removed. This is the complete removal of pelvic peritoneum along with the uterus. So this is after removal. When we see after removal, there is the bladder, the vessels, only the naked vessels are seen, and in between you see the sigmoid. So everything in between, that is the uterus, the ovaries, the pelvic peritoneum has been removed. No disease seen in the pelvis. This is the paracolic area. Everything has been removed. This is after the para-aortic retroperitoneal lymph node dissection has been done. The aorta and the inferior vena cava are visible, and the disease has been removed. This is the subphrenic peritonectomy from the subdiaphragmatic peritonectomy. Below this, you see the liver. So this is after removal. See, this is the diaphragm after the disease has been removed. So after removing the disease, the picture has to be clear. Everything should have been removed. This is how we do HIPEC at our institute. That is the open technique. In closed technique, the abdomen is sutured, whereas in the open technique, the chemotherapy, this picture, like we put the retractor. This is the machine which will have a pump and the heating device, and in this type of setup, we'll be moving the chemotherapy inside the abdomen. So the heated chemotherapy inside the patient, the OT has to be cool so that the patient maintains the temperature. Then the utmost importance is the post-op care, pain management, wound care, nutritional management, the post-operative physiotherapy, the oncologist involvement, intensivist involvement, mobilization, the patient's willpower are these that are key to success of any HIPEC program running at the institutes. Post-op complications that have been noted vary from the 25 to 30% reported in most studies that may mostly include the minor complications. Mortality rates as of now are low, less than 5%. The most problematic things are deep venous thrombosis, pulmonary embolism, which are usually managed with the DVT pumps that are applied intraoperatively, and the prophylactic blood thinners that are given. Other complications vary from wound infection, dehiscence, paralytic ileus, though they can be decreased to a certain extent as if the patient optimization is done nicely. So that was about the cytoreductive surgery and how we go about the HIPEC. Now the importance comes is that timing of HIPEC. We know that when we come to randomized trials, we have one randomized trial which shows the importance of HIPEC in interval cytoreductive surgery. Though we do not have randomized trials for role of HIPEC in primary cytoreductive surgery, consolidative cytoreductive surgery, and secondary cytoreductive surgery. So though that evidence is not there, but we know that the maybe the role of primary cytoreductive surgery and the importance of doing the cytoreductive surgery in primary setting, if possible, is of utmost importance, and adding HIPEC to that will help us. So we should not think that we have data for interval giving HIPEC in interval CRS, so we should avoid primary CRS and do interval CRS and HIPEC. When you talk about the paper, it itself says that only those patients who could not undergo primary CRS were included in the study. So all patients have to be first evaluated thoroughly by a gynec-oncologist, that if they can undergo a primary cytoreductive surgery or not. There are only very few indications that suggest that primary CRS cannot be done. So because the data for interval CRS has come, we should not avoid primary CRS, because the NCCN, the ASCO guidelines all say that stage 3C patients should be given primary CRS if possible. Interval CRS only if the patient is not fit or the disease is not resectable. Only few of the sites are there which say that these are included in the unresectable sites. Most of the disease that we see on the omentum, in the pouch of Douglas, involving the sigmoid, the colon or ureter, these all structures are removable, resectable without much morbidity. So all these patients should go for primary CRS as well as HIPEC, because the importance of HIPEC and the value of HIPEC has been shown in various studies, though a randomized trial is not there. So when we talk about the primary CRS, I would go for primary CRS if possible, because based on one single point, that if we see the disease better, we will be able to remove the disease better. After giving chemotherapy, the disease is diminished, it decreases in size, it makes it difficult for us to remove it. The structures are fibrosed, and the minute disease which would have been otherwise removed is not possible to remove after giving chemotherapy until and unless required for CC0. So the best chance of this removing the disease is at primary surgery if possible, and HIPEC should be added to these patients also. So though the trials suggest that interval CRS is not inferior to primary CRS, at this platform I would like to bring upon the to notice about these trials which show that the CRS performed primarily or interval are same, because in these trials, though the results are same, but the operative time when we look upon is very less. The time is not sufficient for a sufficient CRS to be performed. So primary CRS should be advocated with HIPEC if possible in this scenario, because I say in those trials which have shown the interval CRS is not inferior to primary CRS, in those trials the surgery was not complete, definitely. So concluding my talk, I would say that role of HIPEC along with interval CRS for stage 3 ovarian cancer is proven. Utmost important thing is completion of cytoreduction, that is the CC score. It remains the best prognostic marker. Primary CRS plus minus HIPEC should be done whenever possible. Patient optimization is the key to HIPEC, as adjuvant therapy should not be delayed due to it. Thank you. Talking just a few minutes about the PIPEC, which is upcoming, and we would be able to perform it in near future. PIPEC is the pressurized intraperitoneal chemotherapy in which the pressure inside the abdominal cavity is raised. For now, it has come up mostly in the palliative setting. The trials are going on in the neoadjuvant setting also. So these are the importance is that if we give pressurized intraperitoneal chemotherapy, so the effect will be better. Even the inoperable patients would become operable, or at least they would be benefited by the pressurized chemotherapy to lead a good quality of life. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sati. Such a nice presentation. I have one or two questions to ask. As you mentioned, there are no randomized data as a first line of HIPEC. So still, I would ask your opinion. There are the data where the interval HIPEC is definitely is a better modality. But in our clinical practice, whenever we give neoadjuvant treatment to this advanced category of the patient, we usually combine bevacizumab upfront. So suppose if the patient is receiving chemotherapy with bevacizumab, how you choose HIPEC in this category patient when you perform, or what are the precautions you will consider?
What we usually practice is we wait for 6 weeks. That is when we have a patient who has received bevacizumab cisplatin. Actually, our medical oncologist herself would not give one bevacizumab when we are planning surgery. So Pacli carbo one cycle is given without bevacizumab. So 6-week gap is there. And then when we are planning surgery, we have in mind that these are the patients which have higher chance of bowel perforation and a higher chance of these thromboembolism and these vascular complications. So we keep that in mind. Patient optimization is the key. So we optimize them better and take we are prophylactically giving them the blood thinners, and intraoperatively and postoperatively we will be more cautious in these patients.
Okay, so what I understand, it is better you can avoid bevacizumab because a lot of new complications, because we generally follow the principle which you mentioned. At least one cycle we stop bevacizumab prior to surgery. Maybe 6-week gap is a standard practice even for all, even for the colon cancer where the patient is receiving bevacizumab chemotherapy, that we usually follow. But with HIPEC, there is another risk of bowel perforation, fistulas, and bleeding, even the vascular complications, especially thromboembolism. So that are risks are there. So what is your opinion? So you would consider, or you will prefer avoiding bevacizumab in this scenario where you're planning for HIPEC, or you will still consider continuing the bevacizumab in this scenario?
Still consider. Only thing is, if we have a belief that during surgery, the surgery has been such that we have been near the bowel structures, or we are expecting more bowel complications, then I might avoid doing HIPEC in these patients, because there is no point of doing HIPEC if I am expecting more complications. That would not allow me to give adjuvant chemotherapy within 4 to 8 weeks after surgery.
Okay. And the second thing you mentioned, there is no still randomized trial. So what is the reason which you probably comment on that? It's still we are doing HIPEC and we are getting good results. So why this data is not coming in? There are a lot of other issues which the data is mentioning. There's a delay of the post HIPEC adjuvant treatment, and the patient performance deteriorates. So a lot of reasons are there. But why this data is not maturing with?
See, I started the randomized trial in Rajiv Gandhi Cancer Institute on this primary CRS plus minus HIPEC. But the problem is when you are able, when you talk to the patient, our patients, when we are explaining them that this modality is helpful, we are explaining them the complications of the modality. So after a certain counseling, we counsel them for 1 hour. So after that, they come to a conclusion that either they want HIPEC or they do not want HIPEC. After that, if you say that you will be randomizing them in the OT, so that is not acceptable to most of the patients. So that was the reason when I stopped the randomized trial at my institute there. So I think this is one of the reason that when you are either you want the modality or not want the modality, so then randomizing it in the OT becomes difficult for the patient, from patient side point of view, as well as the treating surgeons or treating physicians point of view.
Okay. Considering the outcome of HIPEC in various scenarios, so you have an option of primary versus ICS with HIPEC, or third is the second cytoreductive surgery, second look. So where you position this HIPEC to get the maximum yield? So you would consider as a first line or in interval, or versus second cytoreductive, currently looking for the outcomes?
Primary CRS is the best time when any surgery or HIPEC will help the patient, if possible. If the patient will not be able to undergo primary CRS, then that patient would require NSCT and interval CRS and HIPEC. So if possible, primary. If the patient is not operable in the primary setting due to medical condition or the diseased condition, then definitely interval CRS. Secondary CRS and HIPEC, we don't have data, but definitely it is helping us. We have seen results and many studies are there, though a randomized trial is out there.
We have interperitoneal chemotherapy data, and which is also a standard of care. If you look for all the guidelines, there are the data of interperitoneal with IV chemotherapy versus IV chemotherapy alone, and particularly those patients who completely resected, there is no residual lesion. I think this interperitoneal with intravenous chemotherapy is one of the standard of care. Even the NCC and all the standard guidelines, where we give combination of both the treatment, especially in that category of the patient, they achieve the complete cytoreduction. So where you position, like if you compare with the HIPEC versus IV plus IP chemotherapy, do you still feel that this would be a better modality in patient where they completely resect?
Are you talking about bidirectional chemotherapy that is given intraoperatively, both IV and IP?
Post-operative adjuvant. So I'm comparing with
post-operative. Yes, late post-operative chemotherapy.
So basically, there's a data of where you can give intraperitoneal chemotherapy. Like you can start with the combination of the systemic chemotherapy on day one, just like you can give paclitaxel 135 milligram per meter square on day one, and day two you give the cisplatin intraperitoneal, and day 8 you give the taxane 60 milligram again intraperitoneal. So that is a combination of IV plus IP chemotherapy, and that is also one of the best outcome. And even if you look for the NCCN all the guidelines, this is one of the standard care. Though the patient who is not underwent a complete cytoreduction, they are not superior in that scenario, and they're not beneficial also. So I'm asking you, like comparing these two modality, upfront HIPEC versus on post-op combination IV plus IP, where you you still feel the HIPEC is superior compared to this modality, because that is also one of the major treatment options, especially in patient that achieve the complete response.
What Paul Sugarbaker sir suggests is he advises both, even HIPEC, then early post-op, and even the late chemotherapy, that even after 3 weeks and we put a port, and at that time the intraperitoneal chemotherapy is given. So there are 4 types of chemotherapy. HIPEC, that is only intraperitoneally hyperthermic. We have bidirectional also, in which at that time we were doing that intraperitoneally, and in the OT only we were giving intravenous also in the same time. And then came the EPIC, that is early post-operative, initial first 8 days, when we would insert the chemotherapy through the drains. But and later on, that is after 3 weeks, we would during surgery we will put a port, chemo port, inside the peritoneum. So the difficulties we faced with that port, we were putting the ports inside the peritoneum during surgery. So the routinely we used to face the difficulties that it would not work. Wherever we would put the catheter, we tried to put it in a way that the port will work. But most of the data also suggests that only 40% patients could complete, or 48% patients could complete those cycles of chemotherapy, because there are adhesions that are formed inside the abdomen. Due to one reason or the other, patient is not able to receive that. Now coming to the early post-operative chemotherapy, same things. The feasibility is not such, the compliance, and it is difficult to give that. So HIPEC has been more easily acceptable, I would say. So the data and the acceptability and the feasibility restricts EPIC and the late post-operative chemotherapy to come up.
Okay, great. So I think you nicely presented and discuss the HIPEC, and I hope you are capturing your own data, and I would definitely happy to see those data you're going to publish. As a first-time user of HIPEC, we are doing in our center regularly in this category of patients, especially the patient presenting in the little bit advanced disease. So thank you, Dr. Swati, and we move on our second talk, the role of PARP inhibitor in advanced ovarian cancer early line by Dr. Mansi Shah. So, Madam.
Sir, hello.
Yeah,
Sir,
Mudassir.
Dr. Mudassir here.
Yeah.
Sir, I have one question regarding the same previous talk about the, not that exactly about the HIPEC, but about the intraperitoneal use of chemotherapy. So, do you use it in your center? Intraperitoneal chemotherapy, which we have a good support.
So as of now, we are not doing intraperitoneal chemotherapy in our patients. We are using intravenous.
And is there any, because I was going through the review of BRCA positive mutant BRCA mutant breast cancer, ovarian cancers. So in that it is preferred, it has been written that it should be preferred, the intraperitoneal chemotherapy should be preferred. So should we be kind of re-looking at, when I remember Viraj, Dr. Viraj also knows that he was part of that trial. So we were doing intraperitoneal chemotherapy in Hyderabad, but somehow we stopped it afterwards, and everybody has stopped probably, almost everywhere.
So you rightly mentioned, so there is a data. The only problem in our setting, because the keeping this intraperitoneal port, and I think Dr. Swati must be agree, because if you see there's a 4 setting what she mentioned. The problem with even the early intraperitoneal and even after within 3 weeks, a lot of the challenges we feel in Indian patient keeping the port, and a lot of patients having the infection and the complication that probably hesitate our practice, because we are very comfortable in intravenous chemotherapy. And I have come across the data of this combination of IV plus IP. That would be one of the major data if the patient is having complete CR after complete cytoreductive surgery. And I think that is actually beneficial compared to the intravenous chemotherapy. So I think that would be easily possible. But I think the only limitation what we are facing is the infection, and we are
the additions formed after the surgery does not allow the even distribution of chemotherapy inside the abdomen. The patient is not able to tolerate the chemotherapy because either it would go to one quadrant or the other. The patient develops bowel obstruction or some of the bowel symptoms, abdominal symptoms. So we used in few patients, but these complications prohibited us from giving, and most of the ports will get blocked, or the distribution was not even. So, and the additions formed, these did not allow us to go ahead with the chemotherapy.
But ma'am, in spite of all these complications, the trial has shown excellent results, with the intraperitoneal chemotherapy.
Yes, it has shown.
We hardly come across any other intervention which has gotten us, so much of survival benefit. We are seeing now PARP inhibitors. This will be the next talk, and it has also led to an overall survival and very significant quality of life improvement in ovarian cancer patients. But the intraperitoneal chemotherapy is also kind of, has also shown across the trials, they have shown improvement.
I think, Mudassir, what I understand, as of now, we are underutilizing intraperitoneal treatment, which I probably in future will definitely going to more sub-update, and probably are going to change our practice. Definitely,
I think so.
Yes, definitely, that is the area that will be coming up.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you.
Madam, over to you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone, for this wonderful discussion. Thank you, Dr. Swati, for the presentation. I hope the residents will be able to come into the OT and now regularly see HIPECs and kind of understand why we are doing what we're doing and how we are doing it. So my goal with this talk today is to basically set the setting for our next speaker, Dr. Ashish Kaushal, and the panel discussion. I'm just going to talk about PARP inhibitors in the early line setting for advanced ovarian cancer, because otherwise it would be a very long lecture.
Can you put on the full screen?
Yeah, sorry. So in terms of why we are so excited about these PARP inhibitors in advanced ovarian cancer is because the outcomes for these subset of patients with stage 3 or stage 4 ovarian cancer has been pretty dismal up until now, with very few drugs that are available. There's platinum-based chemotherapy, there's bevacizumab, which had shown a median progression-free survival of only 10 to 18 months. And to our frustration, majority of the patients with ovarian cancer are diagnosed in this late stages with a 40% 5-year overall survival rate, which is something that we would like to improve on. We also know that as we go ahead with the different treatment options, the median PFS decreases and we end up using multiple lines of chemotherapy with life-threatening complications towards the end in terms of bowel obstruction or fistulas or adhesions. So what we know now is that ovarian cancer comes in a lot of different flavors, and there are at least 5 different histologic subtypes that we are talking about. All these histologic subtypes also have their unique molecular features. So the most common subtype that we know is the high-grade serous ovarian cancer, which we'll go ahead, but 50% of these patients have a deficiency in the homologous recombinant repair system. About 25% of these patients have the BRCA1 or the BRCA2 mutations, which are the most common mutations identified in these subset of patients. Why is biology really important? Because now we actually have a drug that is available to treat these patients. So if you look at all high-grade serous ovarian cancers, the most common mutation that you see is the TP53 mutation, for which there are clinical trials undergoing looking at different investigational drugs. About 20 to 25% of these patients have BRCA mutations. 15 to 18% have germline mutations, and about 5 to 7% have somatic mutations. Because this forms such a huge subset of ovarian cancer patients, I think by now everybody agrees that BRCA testing is mandatory at the time of diagnosis for genetic counseling and familial predisposition discussions, as well as prognostic and predictive factors for drugs. Whom to test? I think this again is no longer a topic of controversy. We no longer test patients only who have a strong family history, because we will miss about 47% of patients of ovarian cancer with these mutations if we just look for the family history. And also age does not really matter. Studies show that about 70% of patients are 50 years or older at the time of diagnosis who have BRCA mutations. When to test? These are the country-specific guidelines, and most of the countries do agree that at the time of diagnosis is probably the best time to test these patients. What to test for? Again, this has been discussed in detail in a lot of presentations, in a lot of meetings. So there are 2 main ways to test for the BRCA mutations: germline and somatic. Because germline mutations are present in all cells, either a tumor test or meaning a tissue sample or a blood test can detect them. Somatic BRCA mutations are present only in tumor cells, and they can be detected only through tumor testing. In my opinion, I think what we do at our Institute for Clinical Practice is that we do both the germline and somatic, unless the somatic, at the time of somatic mutations, the genetic expert tells us that there's a high likelihood of this being a germline mutation because of the allele burden. We might forego sometimes the germline testing, but otherwise we pretty much do both germline and somatic in our patients. So I think this will be covered more in the panel discussion. I'm not going to elaborate on it, but how to read a BRCA report. So this, I think, is very technically challenging for physicians, and we're lucky to have a genetic counselor with us at our institution. But pathogenic mutations are basically deleterious mutations, which are a recognized cause of the disorder. Likely pathogenic or suspected deleterious mutations are previously unreported variations in the mutations. They most likely are expected to cause the disorder. However, I think we still would need long-term follow-up. VUS, variant of uncertain clinical significance. as the name mentions, we should really not base our clinical decisions based on VUS reports. And then there is the likely benign and the benign, which have no clinical importance. So takeaway messages is to test all ovarian patients irrespective of age, family history. BRCA testing at the time of diagnosis is probably more helpful, especially now because we have drugs approved in the first line maintenance setting. Tumor BRCA testing enables detection of both germline and somatic mutations in some patients, not all. And then going over two main trials, which are the SOLO 1 and the PAOLA 1, which have gotten approval for olaparib in the first line setting for maintenance patients. So the SOLO 1 trial included newly diagnosed advanced ovarian cancer patients, mainly stage 3 and stage 4, patients who had undergone surgery either upfront or interval with any surgical outcome, and patients who had BRCA mutations, either germline or somatic. After they finished their standard of care treatment, which involved chemotherapy, surgery, patients were given olaparib maintenance. So this was the dose that was used, 300 milligrams twice a day versus placebo in a 2:1 randomization. And it was given for 2 years. Patients who had a partial response at 2 years could continue the treatment. And the primary endpoint was progression-free survival, with secondary endpoints being PFS2, time to subsequent therapy, overall survival, and health-related quality of life issues. So majority of the patients that were included in this trial were stage 3 patients. About 80% of patients had a clinical complete response after platinum-based chemotherapy. Majority of the patients were serous. 73% patients with BRCA2 mutations and 25% with BRCA2 mutations. If you see, I think patients who had undergone upfront surgery, about 75% patients had no residual macroscopic disease. And at the time of interval cytoreductive surgery, 80% patients had no residual macroscopic disease. So I think this is also a patient selection in terms of selecting really good patients. And maybe at the end of the talk, Dr. Swati can tell us in Indian scenario, in terms of having no residual macroscopic disease, what percentage of patients this would constitute. So this was the progression-free survival. These were the progression-free survival curves at 5 years. So treatment stops at 2 years, but you see that the benefit continues beyond the 2 years and the curves do not start merging, which I think is a very important thing to look at, which might imply curing some of these patients potentially. So 48% PFS at 5 years versus 21% PFS at 5 years. Hazard ratio of 0.33. So this is a pretty significant PFS difference. Now, we know that patients who undergo upfront surgery tend to do a little bit better because they seem to have a lower volume of disease since they did not require neoadjuvant therapy. But it didn't really matter whether the patients got upfront surgery or interval surgery. Olaparib helped in both these subset of patients with almost equal hazard ratios of 0.31 and 0.37. Olaparib also improved progression-free survival regardless of surgical outcome. So patients who had no residual disease, of course, benefited more than patients who had some residual disease, as is the biology of this cancer. But in both subset of patients, there was an improvement in the PFS, again with significant hazard ratios of 0.33 and 0.44. So the secondary efficacy outcomes, which are the PFS2, meaning how the patients did after they received a second line of therapy at the time of relapse. Again, there was an improvement with using olaparib upfront. Safety profile, grade 3 adverse events in about 40% of patients, serious adverse events in about 20% patients. What we have learned from using the drug is that patients who have adverse reactions, dose interruption or dose reduction is an acceptable way to try and keep the drug going. Only about 30 of 260 patients required treatment discontinuation due to AE. And MDS AML has been a big concern with these drugs, looking at the initial data, but there has been no new reported MDS or AML at the 5-year progression-free survival analysis. So the incidence is less than 1.5%. Most common side effects: nausea, vomiting, anemia, diarrhea, and fatigue. So now maintenance olaparib has been approved in the first-line maintenance setting because of the significant improvement in PFS. We are eagerly awaiting the OS results. A reduction in the risk of second progression was observed, and at 5 years, the safety profile remains consistent with the initial reports, with no significant increase in MDS-AML, and quality of life was maintained. Going to the Paola trial looked at again stage 3, stage 4 high-grade ovarian cancers. Patients had received platinum-based chemotherapy and at least 3 cycles of bevacizumab. They were randomized 2:1 again to a maintenance of olaparib plus bev or placebo plus bev for 2 years, olaparib. And again, the primary endpoint was PFS with the same secondary endpoints. The main difference between the Paola trial and the SOLO-1 trial is the Paola trial also included patients who were homologous recombinant deficient or proficient, not just BRCA mutated patients. So about 30% of patients had a tumor BRCA mutation in the subset analysis and 70% did not. Patients were allowed to have surgery at any point. And if you look at the PFS curves for this trial, again, there is a significant benefit in the PFS. However, you can see the difference between the initial curves and these curves where they kind of seem to have a merging effect towards the end. Having said that, the hazard ratio was 0.59 with the PFS survival. Pretty much all patients benefited from the combination of bev plus olaparib, irrespective of age, stage, surgical outcome, timing of surgery. And then if you look at number of patients that were HRD positive, almost about 48% of patients were HRD positive, so significant number of patients, and 35% patients with HRD negative status. So the Paola-1 trial, the summary of the subgroup analysis in terms of the PFS showed that the entire population had benefit of the combination. This benefit was seen more in patients who had BRCA mutations or that were HRD positive, and the HRD positivity was done by the Myriad My Choice diagnostic assay. However, not much of a benefit in HRD negative patients. Again, the side effect profile was pretty much similar to olaparib single agent as seen in the SOLO-1 trial. MDS AML about 1.1% in the olaparib arm. I think the biggest criticism of this study is that it did not have olaparib as a single third arm, which now is the standard of care. But I think at the time of designing the study, they did not have this as they did not have this result. So Paola-1 is an important phase 3 trial because it tells us that you can add a PARP inhibitor to bevacizumab maintenance, and this is the only trial which looks at PARP inhibitors in comparison with the standard maintenance arm. We now know that in HRD positive patients and in patients with tumor mutations or germline mutations with BRCA, adding olaparib to bevacizumab significantly improves PFS. There was also benefit in PFS too, and it is a pretty safe combination. So in the clinic, when we see our patient, there are certain factors that we look at when we talk about maintenance. Clinical factors, surgery, outcome, FIGO staging, what type of drugs the patient has received in the neoadjuvant setting, what are the genomic biomarkers, and also, of course, financial factors and safety profile. So these are the available options for our country. We do not have niraparib as of right now, but niraparib is also approved based on the PRIMA trial in Europe and US. Olaparib is approved for BRCA mutated patients. Olaparib plus bevacizumab is approved as maintenance in BRCA mutated or HRD positive patients. And bevacizumab is approved for all comers with stage 3C or stage 4 disease. And how to select the best choice for patients is something that we'll discuss in the next talk. So thank you. And if anybody has any questions, please feel free.
So, madam, thank you for the nice presentation, and you have been presented data of both the studies, Solo 1 and Paula 1. So, suppose if I need to ask you, you have a patient in your practice, so which patient you will consider bevacizumab, olaparib, and which category of patient you will consider only olaparib? So, how you can decide? Just practical.
So, sir, to be very honest, I think the Paola 1 trial, because it did not have olaparib as a single maintenance, I don't know how much additional benefit we are getting from adding bevacizumab, to be very honest. So for me, I think the way I decide is that if the patient is affordable for olaparib, then I will really strongly recommend them to get the BRCA testing upfront. So I know whether to add bevacizumab for later lines or not. If the patient is BRCA mutated, then I'll just prefer single agent olaparib and save bevacizumab for later lines. So I think a lot of it depends on if the patient is ready for genetic testing and whether the patient is affording for olaparib.
Okay, and the patient who is HRD positive and BRCA negative, I think where the bevacizumab olaparib scores over the olaparib alone, based on the Paula data.
We don't have a head-to-head comparison, sir, with olaparib alone.
So because in that Solo 1 it's a BRCA mutated, I'm talking about HRD positive.
HRD positive, yeah.
BRCA negative.
I mean, I think in my head, I always think that if the patient has benefits in the BRCA mutated, they'll probably have benefit in the HRD positive population as well. Although we don't have data, you're correct.
And what about the stage 2 patient? Do you consider this part in this category of patient, or you keep?
Not for first line maintenance, sir, because we don't have any evidence for early stage. Although I don't know if anybody else is doing that or not, but I think I don't.
Okay. Thank you. I think it's
you.
a great discussion, and then we move on our next thing. We can stop the sharing so that I can share my screen. Okay, great. So next talk is this case discussion as well as the panel discussion, and we have eminent panelists, none other than Dr. Chirag Desai. He's a senior medical oncologist at HOC Vedanta, Ahmedabad. Dr. Mithun Shah, Dr. Mudassir Ahmad, three other medical oncologists, and Dr. Swati Shah, she's our surgical oncologist in Surgical Cancer Center, Ahmedabad. And we also have Dr. Mansi Vishal. She's our genetic counselor practicing at Surgical Cancer Center, Strand Life Sciences, Ahmedabad. So I think we have just like the modification in our program. Our resident will present the case, and meanwhile we do the discussion. So I hope all the panelists are there, and I request all the panelists to please switch on their video so that we can have an interactive session. So Dr. Shweta, you can start with the first case.
Good evening, everyone. So our first case will be a 38-year female, premenopausal, diagnosed in November 2019. Symptom at presentation was abdominal pain and abdominal distension since 3 months, and her staging CT scan showed bilateral ovarian mass with omental caking and mild ascites. Her CA-125 was 2,118 unit per ml. Next slide, please.
So I think we'll start our discussion from this first slide itself. So I think with this case, where there is a premenopausal woman presented with ovarian masses, and especially there is a omental caking in a site with high CA125. So we'll start with our discussion. I think Mudasir, I will start with your opinion first. How you will proceed this patient? Whether you do some additional test or you can decide your line of treatment.
Hello, sir. Good evening, everybody. Okay, so this patient has already undergone a radiological testing, I think. Is it? Imaging has been done?
Yes, imaging is.
So we'd like to do a. Okay, so CT scan has been done. So I would complete the staging if the CT scanning of the chest has not been done yet. So we would like to do that. In addition to that, we need to establish the diagnosis, which we do not seem to have till now. So we will go for there is mild ascites. So if we can get a good some cytology plus a tumor tissue block, so we would like to have that. Because we need to establish the diagnosis. We still do not have that. Then if it is established that it is an ovarian malignancy, then definitely I would go for because it is anyways a stage 3 disease till now. So I would like to go for a the BRCA or the HRD testing in the beginning, in addition, so that I can decide about the further treatment. And this case would be after these things would be discussed in the tumor board, so that we can take a call whether to go for upfront cytoreduction versus a neoadjuvant approach.
Okay, so you are still not sure whether this patient is a candidate for upfront cytoreduction. But the only thing which I understand what you mentioned, you would consider at least cytology or tissue confirmation of this scenario, where you can decide your line of treatment and your primary treatment. So I would ask Dr. Swati, she's our surgical oncologist. So Dr. Swati, what is your opinion? Would you consider any kind of the cytology or stable confirmation this patient? If the patient is a candidate for surgery, you will straightforward go to the surgery without any further test. Dr. Swati, you have to unmute yourself. You have to unmute.
Yes. Yes. First, I would like to assess if I'll be able to do primary cytoreductive surgery or not. If primary CRS is possible, the tissue diagnosis is mostly not required. If it is not possible, if I'm going for interval, then only I would plan for tissue diagnosis with a biopsy. Otherwise, if I'm going ahead with primary CRS, then I would like to do other markers, CEA, CA19-9, CA15-3, mammography, and the colonoscopy and endoscopy also.
So can you repeat what additional marker you will do?
CEA, CA19-9, CA15-3, because I'm not sure of the origin of the primary if I'm going ahead with surgery. And also because there are bilateral masses, I am not sure if it is some GI pathology. So if I'm planning for primary surgery, I would like to do upper GI endoscopy and lower GI endoscopy also, because many times we see that the CT is reported as omentum nodules present, but the patient might not really have the omental nodules, and doing a tissue diagnosis at this point of time might increase the stage of the patient from stage 1 to 3.
Okay. So, this was there at the CT scan. This patient is already in stage 3. I think Mudasir would be agree on that. Patient is having the omental caking. The only point is that radiologically they are saying this looks likely ovarian primary, and this is most likely where it's resectable disease. And in that scenario, probably with the tumor marker, I think there are some mixed opinion. Like as Mudasir said, we may consider biopsy confirmation or cytology confirmation. But what you also mentioned, if you believe this patient is a surgical candidate, you probably look for upfront surgery. And only scenario where you are still not sure, your radiology picture is not sure, there may be some other primary and a Kuppenberg metastasis, or that is the only scenario where you will do additional work to rule out the origin from the stomach or somewhere colon or somewhere else. Okay, so we'll ask to the.
I'm sorry, can I add one? I mean, wouldn't it be just easier to do a biopsy and do IHC? I mean, rather than doing all these tumor markers, doing endoscopy, colonoscopy.
Sometimes what happens is they report it as omental caking, but due to the size of the mass, The size of the mass is not mentioned. When the masses are very large, though the radiology people say that the omentum caking is there or omentum nodules are there, sometimes they are not actually there. So if we are planning upfront surgery and we know the disease is not there, then we should not do a biopsy. Only if we are very much sure that the disease is there, then only we should do a percutaneous biopsy.
Do you want to comment, sir?
Yeah, I think I was trying to make the same point. When the CT scan is suggestive of a solid and cystic mass, there is much more easier to do a biopsy rather than doing the full workup. That will delay eventually the plan of treatment. That was what I was told.
So you believe biopsy is to be done to treat further?
So what about increasing the stage of the patient from stage 1 to 3?
Patient already has omental mets.
Patient is having omental cake.
That is seen on the radiology. How many times we see that the radiology suggests and we do not find it?
How will you
Both ways.
upstage the patient? How will you upstage the patient? It is
By
that,
doing a biopsy, we have seen ruptured tumors inside.
but that will show on CT scan. If it is a mucinous histology and all, I agree with it. When it is a solid cystic mass, then it is
Then also we have seen bleeding tumors and also the ruptured tumors due to biopsy.
So basically, it's more kind of the radiological discussion where the surgeons believe that this patient may be a candidate for complete cytoreductive. So we'll involve our senior panelist, Dr. Chirag Desai, sir. So what is your comment on this case as a beginning?
So, 99 out of 100 times in this kind of patients, the radiologist will be able to tell us whether the omental caking is there or not. And I will tend to agree with the radiologist. Most of the time, I will be able to see the omental caking myself, and I believe my eyes as well. So that's first thing. The second thing is this patient is already having ascites as well. So I will not be very keen to go for extensive workup. A simple biopsy will be sufficient, and I don't think it will upstage this tumor because it's already at a higher stage. So 1% of the patient, I agree with Dr. Swati that if there is a doubt about the primary, if the patient is having bulky ovarian tumor without ascites or without omental thickening, where I'm not sure whether the patient is having primary in the ovary or elsewhere, I will do the workup before touching the patient. But most of the time, the radiology and the pathology will be able to guide our treatment.
Okay, great, sir. So now we have our genetic counselor, Dr. Mansi Vishal, in our panel. So, madam, let me ask you, what is your preference as looking for the primary workup for the molecular testing? What are the tests you're going to suggest and how to do this thing? And what are the timing, especially whether you will do this test at the beginning or probably after a local treatment where the patient is a candidate for systemic treatment? Dr. Mansi Vishal.
Yeah. So yes, since she is a 38-year-old female with ovarian cancer, so I'll go for germline test panel for sure, and specifically for BRCA1 and BRCA2. Because you asked about the timeline also, so related to timeline. So if we are waiting for surgical decisions based on the genetic test report, then before treatment, if it does not affect the treatment much, then I will prefer that after all the treatment, we should suggest germline testing.
Even after completion?
Yes, yes, because there is the patient is going all through so much already. So I would suggest to do it later on.
Medical oncology would disagree because their systemic treatment also depend on the results of this molecular testing nowadays.
Yes, that's what I told. Yes, if we are if the treatment is dependent on BRCA report, then yes, before treatment would be the choice.
Here, what I want to emphasize here, because this testing is going to definitely change the systemic management. So what I understand, like if the patient is a pure candidate of the surgical occurrent resectable disease, I think that is the time where probably surgery would be a first modality of treatment. And after getting the surgical specimen, we have a tissue block that we can submit for further molecular testing and NGS before starting the systemic treatment. That would be one of the preference. If the patient is not a candidate for primary surgery, locally advanced disease, I think I would be agree with what medical oncologist is saying, and we need to do a biopsy confirmation, and probably we will the further test that can be done at tissue and the blood also. So this patient, I think, as far as the radiological picture, Dr. Swati, looks likely to be a operable lesion, which with the umbilical taking is very mild, and I think as for the radiological discussion, if it is a primary operable lesion, considering the volume of the disease and the mild umbilical taking involvement. So what would your complete surgical plan for this patient, and followed by the systemic treatment will ask for the medical oncologist. Dr. Swati, your plan if the patient is resectable.
Yes, I'll just add one CT chest also.
Yes.
And after that, I'll go ahead with surgery, explain about the benefits of HIPEC. So the plan first would be doing a laparoscopy, staging laparoscopy, because the bowel nodules, which are sometimes not seen on CT scan, would may be seen intraoperatively. So first I would like to do a staging laparoscopy and see if the bowel nodules, that is the unresectability, is there or not. Then I will proceed with cytoreductive surgery and HIPEC according to the patient's condition and the completion of cytoreduction.
Okay. And one thing I need to ask you, suppose this patient is underwent CT scan alone, whether it is thorax as well as abdomen pelvis. So do you consider PET scan in this category of the patient, or there is no role of PET scan in ovarian cancer? What is your opinion?
No, as such, no role. Only role is there if we have some nodes which are we are suspicious of if they would be cancerous or not, or we are doing a reassessment after chemotherapy. Then, otherwise, in these type of patients, we are not routinely doing. We are not doing actually PET scans, and as per the guidelines, yet there is no role of PET scan in these patients.
So that is that's why I'm asking, because in ovarian cancer is just such a kind of the cancer where the routine use of PET scan is not recommended. And if the patient is upfront surgically operable lesion, there is no upfront doing histopathology or biopsy, especially if the patient is operable lesion. So, Sweta, you can go ahead further. You have to unmute yourself. Sweta, you have to unmute.
As we discussed earlier, the patient undergo the upfront germline BRCA1 and BRCA2 testing, and her BRCA2 comes positive. And she underwent the upfront cytoreductive surgery in November 2019, and her pathological stage was PT3N1A, FIGO stage 3C, and she received the adjuvant chemotherapy, paclitaxel carboplatin 6 cycle till April 2020.
So that was the treatment which was given to this patient. This patient is germline mutation positive, BRCA2. Patient was operable. As so Dr. Swati assessed this patient, they found the patient is resectable. They underwent advanced surgery. And finally, the stage turns to be stage 3C. And the patient received adjuvant chemotherapy by medical oncologist. Now, we'll start with our panelist, Dr. Mudassir. What will be your maintenance treatment plan for this patient? Do you consider maintenance, or you consider observation with this patient? Dr. Mudassir, please.
Sir, yeah, in this patient, so regarding your one of the previous questions is, the BRCA mutation testing. So I would like to do, though there are very less chances, like probably 5-7% chances may have a tumor BRCA positive. And we know that now that even the tumor BRCA mutant positive patients also will get some benefit from olaparib. So I usually prefer it on the biopsy rather than the germline, because it will give me both of them. Then the second thing is about this patient maintenance therapy. Yes, according to the SOLO-1 trial, the maintenance olaparib therapy would be recommended for this patient, especially if it is, if she is BRCA mutant, if the disease is BRCA mutant, yes.
Okay. So that based on the SOLO-1. So Dr. Mithun, what is your opinion if the patient is not a BRCA positive? So what do you consider maintenance treatment, or you consider any other option?
In non-BRCA positive, I would tend to discuss with the patient the role of bevacizumab, because it is as such, I would like to give bevacizumab from second or third cycle up to 15 cycles, 1.5 years or so of bevacizumab I would like to give. considering it was an high risk disease, node positive disease, they would like to give.
So Dr. Chirag sir, this patient is not received chemotherapy. This is not received bevacizumab during the chemotherapy. Now the chemotherapy is over. Now we are discussing about the maintenance treatment.
It is
What
not
is your opinion considering the maintenance bevacizumab if the patient is non-BRCA?
If the patient is having non-BRCA, I will be tempted to give a PARP inhibitor based on the PRIMA study, because in the PRIMA study, even with non-HRD mutated patient also, the hazard ratio was 0.65. That was the, and the 95% confidence interval was within 1. So that was exciting. But that excitement is based on the single study, and I'm not sure whether I will extrapolate the data from Niraparib to Olaparib or not.
Niraparib is
if
not available in India. That is one of the limitations.
Exactly. So after discussing with the patient, if the patient is able to understand the subtle differences between the trials, if the patient is pushy for the maximum possible treatment and so on and so forth, I mean, that beyond science, what we usually observe in our practice in day-to-day life. If the patient is pushing for maximum possible treatment, I will offer the patient Olaparib. But if the scientist within me is answering, then I will say that I will not be giving Olaparib to this patient.
Okay, so no Olaparib, bevacizumab in case-to-case scenario. Okay,
Yeah.
So can I ask a question to Chirag sir? So Chirag sir, in that case, would you go for the HRD testing, like in whatever way possible?
So that is the one thing.
Of course, yeah. So that is something I wanted to discuss at appropriate time. So in my practice, what I usually do is not to do germline BRCA testing. I do HRD testing only. And if HRD shows BRCA positivity, then I ask for doing a germline testing and then to go for family screening, hand over the patient to Dr. Mansi Vishal. But in my day-to-day decision about using or not using PARP inhibitor, I'm using HRD from tumor rather than BRCA.
So I think let me ask Dr. Mansi, which test would be the ideal, because everybody discussing germline. So there is the data of the sporadic testing also. So Dr. Mansi, what is your opinion? Which test you will advise in this scenario? Germline, sporadic, or HRD, all three, or you will focus on only one or two? Dr. Mansi.
In that case, yeah. So in that case, we can go for a whole panel where HRD genes will be part of it.
Okay.
So HRD genes plus others. And then, as sir said, that later on, family screening can be done by germline test.
Okay. So coming to the family screening.
Ashish, if I can interrupt. So HRD testing, ideally, I will go for the foundation HRD panel consisting of 15 different genes, including BRCA1 and 2. Foundation is not accessible widely to our patients. So in that case, I am utilizing Oncomine panel, which is widely available within our country. That also is testing the same 15 genes. So that's how I am approaching this patient.
Okay, so great, sir. Dr. Mansi, I have a certain question for you. As I one point I mentioned family screening, but before that, I just need to ask you regarding for the interest of the residents. Ovarian cancer, which we are discussing about the BRCA. So can you just elaborate a little bit more about the BRCA? Which BRCA is more common for the ovarian cancer? What are the possibility of the ovarian cancer BRCA 1 and 2? And what are the tests we are doing for that? And if the somebody is in positive, how we look for the family screening for them? Can you elaborate some focus?
Okay. So as we all know, BRCA1, BRCA2, these are the two genes which are the most common genes for hereditary ovarian cancer. Actually, like as a whole, we always say hereditary breast and ovarian cancer. So these are the two most common genes. We won't be able to say, I guess, whether BRCA1 or BRCA2 are, which one is the most common. But the difference is BRCA1 cancers are usually more aggressive than BRCA2. The age of onset is earlier in BRCA1 than BRCA2. These are the two differences. And so to explain further about the germline testing. So whenever we do germline testing, first of all, we always consider BRCA1 and BRCA2. Other genes we will always look later on. So the concept for germline testing is that all of us have 2 copies of each gene. One copy is inherited from our fathers and another copy is inherited from mothers. So like other genes for BRCA1 and BRCA2 also, we have 2 copies. So if one copy is already mutated and the mutated copy is inherited from one of the parents, then the person is at risk for ovarian cancer, because we are talking about ovarian cancer right now. So that's the concept, that there is 50% chance that from the parent, the child will inherit a copy, a mutated copy. And if a person is already carrying one mutation in BRCA1 and BRCA2, they are already susceptible to get ovarian cancer. And ovarian cancer and breast cancer, like I think you asked for the percentage also. So about 20 to 25%, about 20 to 25% of the cases who are hereditary ovarian cancer cases, they have BRCA mutations.
Okay. And what is the age this test should be started? Family screening I'm talking about. If somebody is
family screening.
positive, yeah. So what the age you recommend for the other family member? Where to be?
Yeah. So as soon as somebody gets to know that there is family history of breast or ovarian cancer, that's the time they should go for genetic consultation. But for screening, as per NCCN guidelines, the screening should start from 25 years of age. Actually, screening actually does not start from 25, but the person should go for genetic counseling at that age. Actually, before that, so if you ask me the exact age, then after 18 anytime, right? And according to NCCN guidelines, I think the screening starts after from 25 years of age.
And like there is some information like somebody having the cancer at the age of 30 and the family member should screen at least a decade earlier, like a daughter and their other maybe 1 degree as a decade
earlier.
Yeah.
Yes, a decade earlier. Yes, 10 years earlier.
Okay, great. So Dr. Shweta, and we can continue our case. Yeah, Shweta.
So her post-adjuvant CT scan was normal and CA125 is 3.6 unit per ml. So she is BRCA2 mutant positive. She was started on the frontline maintenance, a tablet olaparib 300 milligram BD from August 2020. After 2 months of the treatment, she develops the adverse effect in terms of the severe coughing and anemia. For anemia, she needs 3-unit blood transfusion within a month. And however, her HRCT shows the only mild thickening of the right horizontal fissure. And her treatment was interrupted for the 15 days. After that, she was started with the olaparib maintenance with dose modification. And she is taking olaparib without much tolerance issue till date.
Okay, so this patient having maintenance olaparib and there are the tolerance issue, but after dose modification, patients are doing well. Okay, so Mithun, what is your opinion as far as the profile? So what you will say?
Yeah, I have seen mainly anemia as the most common toxicity as described in the clinical trial. And other thing I have seen is the fatigue. Fatigue is there. And anemia, few patients develop mild, but in one of our patients, it was a grade 3 anemia. So we had to interrupt as you have done. We did not give blood transfusion. We just interrupted and now the hemoglobin is coming up. So most probably anemia is the major side effect I have seen.
Hematological toxicity, what I understand.
Hematological toxicity.
Okay, great. And Chirag sir, what is your opinion? What is your practice like as far as the tolerance is concerned in this category?
So I am participating in a clinical trial where I have 17 patients. And these patients are in line with study 19. So we are giving 300 milligram BD, not 400 milligram BD. But we are giving in second or subsequent line of therapy as maintenance. So some of my patients had multiple lines of therapy and some of the patients have started after second line of platinum-based therapy. So I agree that most common toxicity was the anemia, but patient also were having significant fatigue as well as the nausea, particularly in the initial 2-3 months of the treatment, and had to reduce the dose of the drug in 2 patients out of 17 patients which I have enrolled because of nausea. I had to reduce the dose because of anemia in 4 patients, and I had to increase the dose of anti-emetic drugs in 4 or 5 patients.
Okay. And what about any use of other PARP inhibitor if you haven't come across in your practice, and what is their tolerance if there any other drug you use as of now?
Not use any other drugs so far, only olaparib.
Great. And Dr. Mudassir, this patient is being given olaparib as an available drug. If the patient is not able to afford olaparib, you have another option of maintenance of this category of the patient, Dr. Mudassir.
Sir, about the first thing about the side effects, I had 2 patients actually whom I started olaparib during the lockdown period, and unfortunately they never came back for the follow-up. And after I received one call one day that from a doctor in some hospital who in which the patient was admitted, and I came to know that patient was admitted with febrile neutropenia.
Oh.
So, so I cannot say that they are like quite benign drugs. So this is not neutropenia as we see in CDK4/6 inhibitors. This is probably kind of, it's just a real neutropenia. And I have seen only mostly hematological toxicity, which is bothersome. The other toxicities are probably manageable, as sir said. And regarding other PARP inhibitors, I have heard now that rucaparib is also becoming available now soon, and it will be probably available at a lower cost, quite lower cost. But there is no data, Ariel 3 data, which rucaparib has, that is in the 2-line failure. It is not in the first line maintenance. So first line maintenance, we have only 2 datas, that is olaparib with Solo 1 and Prima trial for the niraparib.
What are your opinion for this last option, alternative treatment? So do you have any other option where the patient is not affordable for olaparib, or for any reason if the patient is not tolerated olaparib? Do you consider any other maintenance like bevacizumab in this category patient, or you keep?
Bevacizumab, I would consider from the data, because we know that there was significant benefit to those patients who had ascites and who had significant ascites and who had pleural effusion. So in these 2 categories of patients, I consider bevacizumab.
Adjuvant. I'm saying the patient is operated, received chemotherapy, and now we're talking about the maintenance of the patient in the CR.
No. Now, not right now. So I will strictly, be only talking about the trial. So no.
Okay, great. So I think this is the solo data, and Dr. Mansi has already been presented this thing, olaparib versus placebo after receiving the primary treatment, and we have a very impressive PFS. If you look for now we have a 5-year data of the PFS, the 56 versus 13.8 as far as the superiority of concern. And if you look for the toxicity profile, the non-hematological toxicity, mainly nausea, fatigue, asthenia, and vomiting. And but that is not that great extent compared to the placebo. It is not that much. But of course, hematological toxicity is one of the common toxicities, especially anemia, neutropenia, and the thrombocytopenia. And if you see the toxicity profile among all 3 PARP inhibitor, which is there, is be approved as of now, olaparib, niraparib, and rucaparib. I think the toxicity profile is more or less similar among all 3 PARP inhibitor as far as the hematological, non-hematological toxicity is concerned. At last, the dose modification as far as the PARP inhibitor is concerned, we know the starting dose of olaparib is 300 milligram BD, and this is the first dose reduction 250 BD followed by 200 milligram BD, and then third dose reduction is to be discontinued. Niraparib recovery is not available as of now, but I think that dose modification is also 100 milligram subsequent dose, and after the toxicity is concerned. Now coming to the second case, Dr. Shweta, you can start with your case.
Second case was a 52-year female postmenopausal diagnosed in June 2018, and the symptom was presentation is abdominal pain and abdominal lumps since 15 days. And she had a family history positive. Mother and sister had a breast cancer. Her staging CT scan shows the bilateral ovarian mass with omental caking, mild ascites, and enlargement of multiple right internal iliac and common iliac lymph node. CA-125 was 423 unit per ml, and her biopsy was showed the high-grade serous cyst adenocarcinoma. She advised to do upfront germline testing, but at that time she was declined. She underwent upfront cytoreductive surgery, and her pathological stage was PT3N1A, FIGO stage 3B. She received the adjuvant chemotherapy, 6-cycle paclitaxel carboplatin till November 2018, and she had DFS of 10 months. In September 2019, she had recurrent disease, and her CT scan was showed nodular thickening in pelvic peritoneum and sigmoid colon, thickening at the porta hepatis and along the common hepatic artery. CA-125 was 114 unit per ml, and her germline BRCA1 and BRCA2 testing showed the BRCA1 mutation positive. She was started the first-line palliative chemotherapy, gemcitabine plus carboplatin, as the disease is platinum sensitive.
Okay, so I think this patient is platinum sensitive, receive one line of treatment. I think we'll start our discussion with the initial first two slides, where the patient is initially presented with a strong family history, and the CT scan is showing the omental caking ascites with iliac and interiliac and common iliac lymph node with high CA-125, and the biopsy report is available. So I think in our today's discussion, our senior surgical gynae oncologist, Dr. Kalpana, is also there. So, madam, if you are there, I think I need to start with one question with you. Like, suppose this kind of the patient presenting in your clinic, where you have already this patient having a nodal disease in abdomen, you have a biopsy report. So, do you consider upfront surgery in this patient, or do you refer for a neoadjuvant treatment? So, what is your take on that?
This type of case, are you able to hear me?
Yeah, madam, sure. Please, very good.
So this type of case where there is mild ascites, probably the
Madam, you are not audible now.
CT scan is not showing us any evidence of
By the way, your voice is not coming in between. I think, Dr. Swati, can you take this question as
Yes. Yeah, ma'am was about to say that only, because the CT scan is not suggestive of anything that is unresectable. If the patient is medically fit for surgery, we would go ahead with primary.
Primary surgery. Okay. So even with the patient with the nodal metastasis, if the patient, you believe the patient is resectable, you can still consider for upfront surgery, right? What I understand, what you're saying.
Yes.
Okay. I think I would ask for any of the other panelists probably will differ with this plan. Dr. Mudassir or Dr. Chirag, sir, or Mithun. If the patient having such,
no, I think I will discuss with the surgeon. I will discuss with the surgeon. If the surgeon is comfortable operating upfront, why not? Yeah, please. Patient can go ahead with surgery upfront.
Okay, so everybody believes if the MDT believes the primary disease is completely resectable, I think the primary treatment should be a cytoreductive surgery. Okay, so this patient is underwent surgery. This patient node positive disease. The patient received primary chemotherapy without any maintenance treatment, and unfortunately, the patient is relapsed within 1 year period, and DFS was around 10 months. Now, with this patient is categorized with a platinum sensitive recurrence, and the CT scan having a nodulity, this patient was inoperable by the surgical oncologist because a lot of nodules in bowel and pelvic peritoneum, and there is a thickening of the porta hepatitis along with the common hepatic artery. Now this time the germline mutation was done. Okay, so let me involve our this medical oncologist, Dr. What is your treatment plan? Suppose this patient receive the right treatment, or probably differ with some other treatment options.
Sir, this patient is still having a platinum sensitive disease. The treatment free interval was about 10 months. So I would definitely go for carboplatin, the platinum based therapy again. So this is one of the established regimens, so it can be used. There are many other regimens which can equally be used. And the important thing is that at this time we should be going for a second line maintenance therapy in accordance with one of those trials. And we have a drug available also, olaparib. This time she should be receiving that. If she has sensitive disease,
Yes.
she is,
Sensitive disease,
she is responding to this.
Okay, great. So Mithun, do you have considered olaparib as a first line in place of chemotherapy?
No, I think olaparib, the single agent response rates are not that good. So I would still go for re-challenge with platinum, get a response, and then put on maintenance.
Okay. Chirag sir, would you agree with that?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, olaparib always has maintenance.
Okay. And suppose this patient is having a platinum the resistant disease. Suppose that the DFS is less than 6 months. So do you like keep this olaparib still in the second line, or you can consider olaparib as an equal option or maybe a preferred option over other chemotherapy option?
I think I will go ahead with one of the chemotherapy, not olaparib, for platinum resistant disease.
Okay, so you consider first chemotherapy followed by olaparib, if provided the patient.
I don't think I will consider for olaparib in platinum resistant disease.
Won't consider. Okay.
I will not.
Okay. And Dr. Swati, suppose the patient is receive chemotherapy like gemcitabine, carboplatin, and you believe, suppose after the scan, if the patient is still a candidate for a surgery, if they're facing a resectable disease, what surgery you want to offer? Whether you offer a second cytoreductive surgery, or you consider HIPEC in this end?
We can add HIPEC in the setting, but only my doubt is about the resectability, because in the initial setting it was showing the disease at the hepatic artery and the porta hepatis also. So secondary CRS is beneficial only if we are able to achieve a CC0. That look a bit difficult in this setting. But if the CT scan is suggestive of that all the disease at the porta and everything is gone, and intraoperatively we find the same thing and we are able to remove otherwise the other disease, then we might add on the CRS and HIPEC to this patient, secondary CRS and HIPEC.
So if the patient has excellent response, you will consider HIPEC. But the only problem with the HIPEC, you can still in surgery, you can find a lot of nodules in the patient has the bowels have been there, yes, some deposits. So that is one of the challenge, and probably you can land it with the resection of those kind of bowel if you want to achieve CC0.
And in these setting, patients, if we are doing CC1, the patients are not benefited. So only if CC0 is possible, then only I will consider going in.
Okay. If I can add, Dr. Swati, correct me wrong. Generally, the second surgery is to be performed if the recurrence is delayed beyond maybe a year, or preferably beyond 2 years. That is first thing. Second thing, this patient was having nodal disease to begin with. So that makes this patient a little poorer candidate for second line or secondary cytoreductive surgery. And the third thing is this patient is having quite extensive disease. So that also makes the patient unsuitable for second surgery. If the patient had recurrence beyond 2 years, only a single site of peritoneum, that would make the best choice for the second surgery. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. More than 2 years is the best time. More than 1 year, but 6 to 12 months also we do consider, as the criteria for platinum sensitivity has been changing. Now the 6 to 12 months is also considered. So 6 to 12 months are also the candidates. But, and second point regarding the nodes, the recurrence has not been in the nodes. The recurrence has been in the peritoneum. So that is why I might consider. But I am also doubtful that if the patient would be surgically resectable or not. So first I would like to put a scope only, so that I do not put an incision, so that I'm not delaying any chemotherapy if I'm not able to achieve a CC0. So I will just put up scope. That also, if these radiologists are suggesting me that all the disease at the unresectable site is gone.
So I think what Dr. Swati has mentioned is a proper selection of the candidate is one of the major thing. Though, as Dr. Chirag mentioned, the DFS would be another important thing. Look for the biology. That would be one of the major criteria of assessing this category of the patient. And of course, in selected category of the patient, where very limited recurrence, and I think they can be still salvaged with the second cytoreductive surgery. And case-to-case basis, we can go ahead. And this patient, as Dr. Mudassar has mentioned, this patient is the data of the PARP inhibitor and the recurrence setting, and this patient received olaparib and without any major tolerance issue except for grade 1 anemia and fatigue, and no much dose modification or needed. So the patient is still doing good. So coming to some of the data which is there for the platinum-sensitive BRCA-mutated recurrent ovarian cancer. And this is the data of the SOLO2, and this is the phase 3 data where the olaparib is compared with the placebo in the patient who receive at least 2 lines of the platinum-based treatment, and they have a CR/PR with most of the therapy. And the primary objective of this is the PFS. And if you see the PFS versus olaparib versus placebo, is a very strong HR is 0.3, is clear-cut superior over placebo as olaparib. And we have a SOLO3 data also, especially in the scenario where the patient is being relapsed and they have been given chemotherapy at least 2 lines, and that is also showing a very good overall response rate and compared with the the placebo option. And this slide is showing the approval based on the PFS results of various PARP inhibitor. We have olaparib, niraparib, and rucaparib. And there is a data of study 19 SOLO2 in BRCA-mutated patient where this olaparib is approved based on the excellent PFS at HRS 0.35 in study 19 and 0.3 in SOLO2. And we have a niraparib data based on the NOVA studies with a very strong HR and in the patient of BRCA-mutated, even 0.27, even in the patient is non-BRCA-mutated, and it is in 0.53. And third, we have the rucaparib data on the basis of ARIEL-3, where even the intent to treat population, the HR is quite positive. The PF is 10.8 versus 5.4, and the HR is 0.36, while in the BRCA positive, it is very strong 0.23. So I think all 3 PARP inhibitors are really good in this category patient. So coming to our third case, Dr. Shweta, you can begin.
Good evening. We have a case of 50.
Dr. Shweta, yes, please.
Yes.
Shweta is our first year DNB resident, sir.
Good evening. We have a case of 53-year-old postmenopausal female who presented to us with the complaints of abdominal distension since 1 month. Her family history was non-significant. Her CT scan was suggestive of bilateral ovarian mass with omental caking and pleural effusion. The biopsy was suggestive of high-grade serous carcinoma, and CA-125 was 2,356 units per milliliter. She took neoadjuvant chemotherapy, 6 cycles of Paclitaxel and carboplatin till March 2019. After that, she underwent cytoreductive surgery plus HIPEC in April 2019. The staging turned out to be T3C, N1A, FIGO stage 3C, followed by she took adjuvant chemotherapy, 2 cycles of Paclitaxel and carboplatin till June 2019. After that, she had a DFS, disease-free survival of 5 months.
So I think we'll start with our discussion with this case. I think we'll start first with Dr. Swati or even Dr. Kalpana if she's there. I think we'll start. This patient is having a pleural effusion, though this patient receives neoadjuvant chemotherapy based on the disease volume. So the point of this discussion here, this patient is in afferent stage 4 disease, which was radiologically converted to the stage 3. So do you justify this patient having HIPEC at this moment, where the patient responded with the...
If this is one of our patients, there has to be a cytology of the pleural tapping. And if that is positive, even if we get a radiological stage 3 after neoadjuvant chemotherapy, we don't go for HIPEC.
Okay, so
if that tapping was negative, we would go for HIPEC.
So if this patient was suppose we consider cytology was negative, even this patient having a radiologically, there's the nodes are there. So do you consider HIPEC, ma'am?
Multiple nodes, usually when they are metastatic, they are shown as being metastatic. we do not prefer HIPEC because HIPEC is not supposed to have very good effect on nodal disease. So chances of recurrence are higher even after HIPEC.
Great. So what I understand, if the patient is a pleural fluid cytology is positive, if the patient has multiple nodal disease, if the patient is not able to achieve a CC0, I think that kind of the category of the patient, HIPEC is not a preferred modality of the treatment.
Absolutely. If we do not achieve CC0 at interval debulking, then it is pointless to do a HIPEC because, you know, at interval debulking, there is already the disease which is hidden because of the effect of chemotherapy. So that is what we are leaving behind in form of microscopic disease. But if, you know, even after that, if we are not able to achieve a CC0, a CC1 also should not receive HIPEC.
Okay, great. So let me ask our medical oncologist colleagues, Dr. Mudassir, this patient having the DFS just 5 months. So what would be your any additional workup or what would be your plan for the further treatment?
So, sir, we in this case, if we visit, this is now a resistant. So previously, patient has received. Okay, this is a new patient. So this is.
So this is the third case where we are dealing with the DFS of 5 months after receiving the last chemotherapy, and the subsequent case we have a platinum sensitive disease.
Right, but this patient, you know, has undergone a HIPEC after the initial neoadjuvant therapy, isn't it, sir?
Right.
Yeah. So this patient did not receive bevacizumab at that time because she could have been a candidate for bevacizumab.
There is a lot of challenge, Mudassir.
I agree. But this patient did not receive that. I don't think there could, you know, after completing the treatment, there is any other role. But mutation testing, if she is able to afford it, you know, this is a resistant disease, though there is no direct data, but there is a data that, you know, it may help. So wherever there is a BRCA mutation present, I think we should be offering them the olaparib at least once in their course of, you know, whole treatment.
So you will consider this PARP inhibitor without any further chemotherapy, or if the patient is BRCA positive, you look for that, or you will consider first systemic chemotherapy followed by the result based on the
first systemic chemotherapy. So if this patient, okay, so at the time of relapse, after okay, you are asking, you are saying that there is a relapse in 5 months, and now what to do? So yes, definitely patient will go for as if she was a non-BRCA mutated. So she will definitely go for a single agent second line therapy probably, or maybe a double agent if she is, you know, has very good PS. I would go for a second line, maybe a liposomal doxorubicin or something.
Liposomal doxorubicin single agent, right? I would come to our genetic counselor, Dr. Mansi Vishal. Dr. Mansi, this patient is not underwent any kind of the molecular testing, and now you have a relapsed patient where initially treated with the chemotherapy, HIPEC, and which is short interval of the period, 5 months, the patient is relapsed. Would you consider the mutation analysis? Our medical oncologist is still wants to give chemotherapy. They believe even with this report, they are not going to change their treatment. What is your opinion?
Then only germline testing needs to be done at this stage.
We will consider germline testing. Why not?
Yes.
Why not somatic? The treatment is maybe based on the somatic also.
Because you already said that medical oncologist is already saying that they are not going to change that.
So let me refer to the Mithun followed by Dr. Chirag sir for their opinion. So Mithun, what will you consider?
Sir, I have one point before sir comes in. I have one point to make. So in this patient, definitely patient will go for the second line therapy. We have to decide about the second line maintenance therapy, whether we'll give any or not. If we do the NGS testing or the mutation testing, if it is present in the somatic, so it will probably give us the both, you know, when somatic is when tumor test is positive, we consider that this patient may be having either a somatic or a germline mutation. So regarding the counseling of the patient, we'll be doing later on testing germline again. So that is a separate question. But to decide about the second line maintenance, I think we would be we would need a NGS testing.
Okay, so you will consider post second line maintenance and look for the molecular testing. Okay, let me ask with other medical oncologists, Dr. Mithun and Dr. Chirag sir. What
I agree that we start with a single agent liposomal doxorubicin or gemcitabine weekly, explain the patients whether there is addition of bevacizumab in platinum resistant if they can afford, and plus do a tumor HRD plus a BRCA, the whole panel of mutation testing, because the family history is not there. So we are likely to pick up some non-germline, non-BRCA mutation by doing HRD testing at this moment.
Okay. Chirag sir, you have any other additional comment?
So I agree with the initial part of what the others said, that I will give liposomal doxorubicin or maybe weekly paclitaxel, maybe with bevacizumab. So far as the mutation or NGS testing is concerned, we need to consider 2-3 things. The first thing is that BRCA or HRD testing, reluctantly, yes, I will not be very enthusiastic in pursuing a PARP inhibitor in this patient. So maybe I might do that. But broad NGS testing, whether I will do or not, that is first thing. Second thing is that I go for something like MSI, which will help in selecting whether this patient will respond to immunotherapy in future or not. So that's first thing. MSI I will do. And if I'm doing the broad NGS testing, I would like to look at something like NTRK rather than BRCA. So I will not be very enthusiastic about looking for BRCA, but I will look for something for immunotherapy or something like entrectinib.
So where you place this immunotherapy? Suppose if you got this test and MSI is high, so you will consider immunotherapy or you consider second systemic therapy, which other medical?
After second systemic therapy.
After second systemic therapy as a maintenance?
Yeah.
Or as for third?
No, not as maintenance. No, that's subsequent line of therapy.
Keep immunotherapy option as a third relapse. Okay. Shruti.
Yes, sir. So after 5 months, when we did the CT scan, it was suggestive of multiple lymph nodes in perigastric, celiac axis, mesenteric, and para-aortic region, along with cervical left level 3 and 4 and supraclavicular node. CA125 was 64 units per ml. Her germline testing was suggestive of BRCA1 mutation. And so she received first-line palliative chemotherapy, PAG liposomal doxorubicin and bevacizumab till March 2020.
Okay, so we'll start with the Dr. Swati. Dr. Swati, looking to the CT scan with this kind of the picture, the medical oncologist plan for palliative chemotherapy. So do you agree with that? This patient is not a surgical candidate now.
Not a surgical candidate.
Okay, great. This patient received bevacizumab additional to the liposomal. I think Mudassir was saying that bevacizumab can be added. We'll see bevacizumab combination now. Now we'll ask our other medical oncologists, if the patient has achieved CR or PR with this combination, what would be your further maintenance treatment? I'll start with the Mudassir first.
So, sir, in this line, we do not have a good data, though if it was a first line, so this patient had received, she had received bevacizumab, we could extrapolate the data from Paula-1. But here in the second line maintenance, we do not have that data. So I don't know, as sir said, Dr. Chirag sir said that, this in resistant disease, olaparib may not have the same benefit. It is probably everybody's guess what to do in this condition, but I would like to give one of the maintenance therapies.
So what maintenance? You'll consider olaparib, you'll consider bevacizumab, you'll consider combination of the both?
Not combination. I would not bother the patient with such a combination because the toxicities will increase.
Okay.
So I would give one of them. Probably I would be inclined more towards giving BRCA, I'm saying olaparib, PARP inhibitor alone.
Chirag sir, would you agree? Because you
agree.
The data of the Paula here.
Yeah. So if I have to extrapolate from the data of Solo 2 versus Paula, I would want to err towards Solo 2 rather than Paula.
But this patient is responding with the bevacizumab. You'll discontinue bevacizumab and you will start with the PARP inhibitor in this scenario. So,
we have not given platinum to this patient, and PARP inhibitor is with platinum sensitive disease after platinum therapy. So yeah, exactly. So it's a difficult choice, but of the two drugs, if I have to select one, looking at the BRCA mutation, I will want to use my PARP inhibitor now, and I might reintroduce bevacizumab in the subsequent line of therapy if required.
So the patient is doing good with the bevacizumab with liposomal. Now the patient is achieved CR/PR. You will withhold bevacizumab. You will keep PARP as a maintenance, and you will keep this bevacizumab as an option for the third line combination. I think
so you do anything. Everything is correct.
So we are doing the right discussion here. What I understand.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think this patient was given a combination of the both, and patient is still doing well without any major interruption, and that is the good thing for this patient. Now coming to some of the important data, I think PAOLA-1 we didn't discuss. I'm not going. The only thing is the PAOLA-1 is for the first line. It's not for the resistance setting. So I think we can only do the extrapolation. And the best part of the PAOLA-1, which Dr. Manshi has mentioned, it is not only for BRCA, even those patients who are HRD positive, even they are excluding BRCA mutation, they are still getting a good benefit. The PFA is 16.6 versus 28.1, even those patients is exclusion of the BRCA, though it is not that beneficial for HRD negative or unknown patient. Now coming to the data of this PARP inhibitor, and these are the approvals which based on the various studies for all these three PARP inhibitor, even for bevacizumab. I'm not going into detail, we already discussed. And these are the FDA approved PARP inhibitor, current indication of ovarian cancer. The only thing is emphasis here. In the first line, we have approval for olaparib and niraparib, but the best part is that niraparib has been approved even the patient of regardless of the BRCA mutation. Even the patient who are the first line, the patient is the BRCA negative, the patient is stage 3 and 4. I think there is FDA approval for niraparib as a maintenance treatment and irrespective of the BRCA status. While in the patient who has a relapse and they have responded with the first line treatment post relapse, I think there's the data of maintenance of all three PARP inhibitor regardless of the BRCA mutation status. And coming to the last part of this slide, where the olaparib and niraparib is also approved for the fourth line in the patient, they have been germline mutation positive, even for niraparib for HRD positive, while the rucaparib is mainly for the approved as a third line and beyond treatment for BRCA positive mutation cancer. So these are the paradigm for the first line ovarian cancer. So whenever we have a patient of ovarian cancer, we need to go for the panel testing. I would be comfortable with both germline as well as the sporadic, and should also look for the HRD testing. Then if the patient is a primary operable patient, the surgery should be done. An optimal cytoreductive surgery, Dr. Swati has already mentioned what are the surgical points you need to consider. And if the patient is not a candidate for primary surgery due to the volume of the disease, as of now, there is no survival benefit of the neoadjuvant chemotherapy over surgery. But neoadjuvant chemotherapy with optimal developing should be done. And the chemotherapy regimen, usually we give the combination of the taxane platinum, addition of the bevacizumab based on the volume of the disease. Now we have a data of the high volume, especially in stage 3 and 4, we combine with the bevacizumab. But if the bevacizumab is not given, I think we look for the further maintenance treatment after chemotherapy based on the BRCA mutation and HRD data. And if the patient is being BRCA mutant, there is the olaparib and niraparib is approved. If the patient only HRD positive, I think niraparib is approved. And if the patient is receive bevacizumab, then I think the maintenance treatment is a combination of the both based on the PAOLA data. And if the patient is human recombinant proficient, I think that is the only category I would consider a maintenance of the single agent bevacizumab till the patient is good. So with this, I thanks to all the panelists for their active participation, and the speaker, Dr. Swati and Dr. Mansisha, for their nice presentation. And I thanks to AstraZeneca for their contribution for this meeting. And if Dr. Bhavesh can come and if you have any last word, I can invite him, or otherwise we can conclude this meeting. Thank you. Thanks to all. Madam, you want to say anything, Kalpana madam?
No, we are good. This was a very nice discussion. And I think our knowledge regarding olaparib has been really updated well, though we will always depend on you people to decide which patient will receive olaparib first as first line maintenance, second line maintenance. And, but it was really great knowing a lot about olaparib. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. With this, I think I conclude the meeting. Thanks and good night to everyone. Thank you.
Oh.
Thank you.